Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Working and Learning and Living Conference that we are offering today. Today, we have the pleasure to be here with Federico Demaria, okay, in this conference in which we are going to try to explore a little bit new ways, new paradigms to conceive our world. What we are collectively assuming is that we need economic growth to solve most of the problems that our society has. Federico Demaria is here to explain how economic degrowth, in this case, could be even more useful than growth. Just to introduce you, Federico is a professor of ecological economy at the Barcelona University. Federico has published in 2016 his book, Degrowth, a vocabulary for the new era, that has been translated into more than 10 languages, and recently has published The Case for Degrowth, in which he does different recommendations for public policies and private management. If there is anything I'm missing, Federico, it's up to you. Now it's your turn.
So, thanks a lot.
Welcome.
Carlos. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to you and everyone. I guess you can see my screen, hopefully, sharing. So here I am today, very happy to be with you all to share a little bit some thoughts on this very unconventional idea of degrowth. So just to get started, the case for degrowth is a case for living simply so that others might simply live. It is a case for reducing production and consumption in the global north, especially among the rich north and south. My case for degrowth consists of 4 arguments and 1 rebuttal. First, I will argue that the current crisis is not a crisis of lack of growth, but of unbearable social and environmental sacrifices in the altar of growth. Second, I will explain how degrowth must be rooted on different ways of being and relating for short-term simplicity and the commons. And third, I will present 5 core policies that are crucial, I think, for a transition toward degrowth. And fourth, I will explain how I see the politics of degrowth as an articulation between the personal, the communal, and the political. And then I will conclude responding to 3 common objections to degrowth. The first one is that degrowth is unnecessary since green growth can do the job. The second one is that degrowth is unjust since the global south and the poor need growth. And the third one is that degrowth is politically impossible. So let me start with the first part of my presentation and my argument, which is about the sacrifices in the pursuit of growth. So this is basically what the graph of global GDP growing 3% per year looks like. This is what is considered to be normal by economists and policymakers. But compare 2018 to 2100. Compound growth is the madness of economic reasons, David Harvey wrote. And I think it's indeed. As we joke in the book, The Case for Degrowth, to an archaeologist in the future, our civilization obsession with growth will seem as strange as that of ancient Greeks worshipping 12 gods on the mountain top who masquerade as bulls to have sex, and more deadly than the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of humans on the Aztec pyramids. And this is what I will explain next. Consider, for instance, the austerity cuts to keep overdeveloped economies growing, the demolition of health or educational infrastructure that took so much effort to build, the unprecedented debt to keep consumers consuming, the rich rich, and economies afloat. The world debt has hit a record. For example, in the first quarter of 2018, it was about $247 trillion. Growing at about 11%. And between 2009 and 2019, the European Central Bank pumped almost 2.6 trillion into banks, and the US over 4 trillion. This is a lot of money. And this money ended up on the pockets of the rich, and from there to stock and houses. Houses prices skyrocketed, and common people can no longer afford to live in city centers. In the 100 cities worldwide, corporate buying of existing property exceeded 600 billion from mid-2013 to mid-2014 and 1 trillion a year later. For example, this is the case in Barcelona, where housing prices are increasing a lot, but also in many other cities, probably the one where you live yourself. San Francisco, one of the world's richest cities in the world, is in the midst of a feces crisis. Poor people without homes defecate in the streets. Now, nature is also sacrificed on the altar of growth. Plot any graph of a global environmental impact, for example, carbon dioxide emissions, water use, ocean acidification, waste dumping. You have a few on the graph I'm showing, but you can choose any of them. And you will find a hockey stick figure like that of GDP. This is not a coincidence, I argue, because the acceleration of GDP is what accelerates environmental impacts. Just to give an example with biodiversity, 145 scientists from 50 countries working for the 2019 UN report on biodiversity and ecosystem services concluded that, and I'm quoting, nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, end of the quote. Just to give a few examples, bird population across the French countryside have fallen by a third over the past 15 years, and 3.5 billion bee colonies have been lost in the US from the 6 million counted in 1947. Now, if all countries were to meet the commitment that they signed in the Paris Agreement, global temperature would still increase a disastrous 3 degrees. I have a 3-year-old son, and this makes me worried, to tell you the truth. IPCC climate models that I'm showing in the graph square growth with 1.5 degrees only by assuming unproven and untested bioenergy with carbon capture to take carbon out of the atmosphere. This is clearly very crazy, not very tested, and very expensive also. So tellingly, and this is what interests me here, the only IPCC model that doesn't assume this untested technology involve fast energy decrease, which is what we are calling for with degrowth. So to conclude this first argument, I think we should be reaching for the emergency brake, as Walter Benjamin put it before the Second World War. But then the difficult question becomes, how do we do this? And this is the subject of the rest of my presentation. Now, to think what is to be done, one needs to start from those who are already doing things differently. And I think this is also the topic of the conference. Those who live simply, in my case, so that others can simply live. Let me give a few examples. The first one is Pope Francis, for example, who eschewed the palatial papal residence in favor of a hostel suite. Or the former president of Uruguay, José Mujica, who lived at his humble farm on the outskirts of Montevideo, which you can see in the picture, donating 90% of his presidential salary. Or Winona LaDuke, a Harvard-trained economist who twice ran for US vice presidents with the Green Party, living most of her life modestly on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota while fighting against oil pipelines. So the point here is that there are also innumerable others among us who practice modest living. For instance, city folks who find contentment in work, family, or friends without striving for ever greater wealth and power. Or farmers, for example, who produce enough to reproduce their community without exhausting natural resources. Or pensioners that dedicate to community work. However, the prevalent ideology wants us to think we are each on our own, that it is our nature to want more and more, that everyone wants to live like a rich Westerner, that there is no alternative to capitalism. None of this is true, of course. Evolutionary biologists and economists, as you can see in the books that I'm showing in the PowerPoint, tell us, for example, that humans have multiple potentials. We are selfish and we are altruist. We desire more, but we also live content with less. We want our own things, but we also share generously. It is, and this is important for my argument, it is our institutions that reward some propensity or reprimand others. An institution change Importantly, we only survive and advance by cooperating. We are a cooperative species. No baby can go far in life alone, like my son. So it is naive, of course, to think that change is a matter of personal volition only. No matter how simple or slow you might want to be, you can't, if you live in a North American suburb like the one you see in the picture and work miles away from home. Car driving is the only option. But if you live in Copenhagen, surrounded by beautiful bike paths, it is easier to cycle to work or school, together with 50% of the population. So conducive environments co-evolve with personal desires and habits, networks, and changing institutions. As people come together to do things differently, they also organize politically to defend and assist their way of living and being. People are already doing things differently, and this is what I'm trying to argue. For instance, as feminist economist Gibson Graham argue, the capitalist economy is just the tip of an iceberg sustained by immense voluntary, reciprocal, and not-for-profit activity, as you can see in the picture. So often in the form of what we call the commons, which is cases in which people working with one another and sharing resources for a common purpose. The commons are not only cooperatively governed forests, fisheries, or aquifers, like the one that the Nobel Prize in Economics Elinor Ostrom studies, but also shared urban spaces, open software, festivities, community gardens, and occupied squares. So against the pushes to privatize and commodify the commons, movements have defended and reclaimed commons. And these struggles and community economy are the roots upon which to cultivate degrowth. And I want to give you now a few examples, just not to make this too theoretical. So in the city where I live, Barcelona, there are some 300 cooperatives interconnecting 10,000 people and supporting the livelihoods of 6,000. If you are in Barcelona, there are many services and goods that you can get from cooperatives. For example, you can become a member of the cooperative Som Energia, getting 100% renewable electricity at affordable cost. You can share an electric car for Som Mobilitat. You can get to the internet through another cooperative. You can receive primary care health. You can live in a co-housing unit built by another cooperative. You can take turns in a parent-run child care group. You can grow vegetables in a community garden. You can buy from local farmers, or you can listen to new bands in citizens-run social centers. So what is the point here? The point is that by participating in the economy of the commons, you produce and consume differently, and you devote your time and resources to a parallel economy. So crucially, by being a commoner, you are part of the broader change you want to see, like the first traders and bankers in the nascence of capitalism. In 2015, we elected in government in Barcelona the Party of the Commons, which is called in Catalan, as you can see in the picture, Barcelona en Comú, a movement party staffed with seasoned activists from the city commons. Barcelona en Comú protected existing and opened up new commons, and this is what co-evolutionary possibility towards degrowth look like. But now the question is, what can a movement party that takes state power do in a degrowth direction? Because obviously in municipal policies, there are limits to what you can do. So next, I'm going to mention 5 non-reformist reforms that we think could act as leverages for the change towards degrowth. The first one is a Green New Deal without growth. And by this, I mean a bold investment program anywhere near 3% of GDP annually to decarbonize energy and transport, reforest, and transform agriculture. 3% is what many nations spend right now for their armies, and in fact, they're spending more than that. Without growth, a Green New Deal could be financed by taxes, redirection of expenditure or subsidies, or states issuing money to fund expenditure with social returns that modern monetary theory supports. By circumventing banks to finance the transition, money will not enter the economy as debt, with the demand for growth to pay the interest. The second proposal that I want to put forward is that of a universal care income and the one of a universal basic services. A basic income at about 20% of per capita income can be funded with an increase of taxes of the top 15% of income. Simulations for Catalonia, for example, show. We call this a care income to emphasize it is given in recognition of the unpaid care work of all of us, and mostly women, do, without which economies could not exist. Economists at the London University Global Prosperity Institute have developed a plan for guaranteed housing, food, transport, and internet access that would cost the equivalent of 2.3% of the UK GDP, an amount that could be raised by eliminating 2/3 of the tax breaks currently available in that country. The third proposal, and obviously all these proposals are complementary, is the one to reduce working hours, 1 day less per week, sharing this way the available work among more people, reducing unemployment, distributing more fairly the benefits of productivity, and reducing environmental pressure. The fourth proposal, support for the commons, includes municipalizing communal services such as water or energy, policies to reclaim public space from commercial use, or active support with legislation and financing of thriving social and solidarity economies. I don't have the time now to go into the details, but the last proposal is important because it's about how we pay for all this, how do we finance all this. So basically it's an overhaul of taxation and fiscal system. And let me give you a few ideas. First one would be to tax carbon and resource use and not work. Second would be to return revenue from a carbon tax as dividend to poor people. Third, to tax high income more, tax wealth and transnational capital, and use these proceeds to fund equality and sustainability. Fifth, to set a maximum income. For instance, a good yardstick is the international standard wage mark, already used by companies, not-for-profit organizations, and government agencies, to certify that the ratio between the highest and the lowest earners is within 8:1 ratio. Okay. So others have proposed these policies before. I acknowledge that. Our difference is that we conceive them as levers for a great transformation beyond growth and capitalism, socializing property and redistributing resources and time out of capital circulation. Importantly, we conceive this institution in synergy. Each alone in a growth context would change little. Resource, corporate, and wealth taxes may fund the Green New Deals or basic services, relieving the pressure for growth to pay for them. Basic income or carbon dividends might stimulate consumption, but resource and carbon taxes disincentivize ecologically harmful choices. Community economies strengthened by our policies offer outlets for creative energies liberated by reduced work hours or secured by universal income. So as economies slow down, social safeguards make sure no one falls off the net. And by opening up the commons and increasing security, we reduce the need for growth. Now, you could argue that these policies are not new, but they are too radical to stand a chance in electoral politics, more so in a degrowth direction. So this brings us to the important question of the politics of degrowth. Now, here it's very obvious that we won't have policy change unless there are people who want it. And there will not be people who want it unless political institutions allow spaces where people can want different things. So the question is, how do we articulate then the personal, the communal, and the political? In our book, for example, The Case for Degrowth, we propose strategies of building new common senses, a concept we take from Italian intellectual Antonio Gramsci, through cultural changes embodied and practiced in the making and defense of commons, articulated and generalized through political movements that promote such commons. So protest, reform, and prefigurative personal and collective change are then interrelated, and one needs the other. Let me give you an example. If you stop eating meat, but the European Union agricultural policy subsidizes large-scale meat industry, then little will change. If, however, you also buy food from your locally sourced cooperative and you alongside others organize to elect government that challenge the agri-food system, then something might actually change. Now, already to get to the last part of my presentation, let me move to 3 common objections to degrowth. And I'm sure you have more than 3, but at least I want to cover the most common ones, okay? So the first one is that degrowth is not necessary, since we can have both growth, economic growth, and reduce environmental impacts, with those ideas that are sometimes called dematerialization or decoupling. So recent works like the ones of Andrew McAfee from his book More from Less celebrates a supposed peak material consumption, pointing to reduction in domestic resource use in high income countries. So it is basically the red line in my graph, alongside economic growth, that is the blue line in my graph. Now, this is an artifact of globalization, and there is a problem with this argument, because if you look at material footprint, which is the green line in my graph, that it means that the total resources used to produce the goods of a country consumes includes import, then the relationship between the material footprint and economic growth is positive correlation. So as the economy grows, you consume more. So in a globalized economy, footprints are our best guide, and these increase with GDP. Now, there are gladly, for example, 21 countries that reduced their carbon footprint between 2000 and 2014, although their economies grew. But they reduced them on average by 1 or 2% per year. So climate scientists estimate that high-income nations should reduce their emission by 10% each year, not 1%. In line with the fair sharing of 2 degrees carbon budget. Now, the slower the growth, the easier to reduce emission. In fact, these 21 countries that reduced emission saw also low GDP growth in the same period, close to 1% on average annual. That's what we call, well, even the IMF calls secular stagnation, the fact that high-income nations are not growing as much as they used to do. But if growth were closer to 3% per year, for example, there would hardly be any reduction of emission. Let me give you another example. Here in the graph, you see a post-COVID recovery scenario, which has been built by colleagues Alyosha Slammerslag, Dan O'Neill, and Yorgos Kallis. So what it shows is that even an ambitious global Green Deal, the yellow line in this graph, fails to keep global emission within 2 degrees, which is the Paris Agreement objective. And this is represented by the blue shaded area. So the only recovery path that stays within the envelope of 2 degrees, IPCC path, is the green line, combining fast decarbonization, reduced energy use, and crucially, zero GDP growth in the global north. So basically, this is degrowth. So such empirical realities will not deter economists who see humans as kind of psyches, pleasures machines that can get more and more value out of stuff without more demands on resources. But if value is translated into money, though, those who make money selling immaterial pleasure can use this money to buy material goods or services. Think of a yogi guru who buys a Ferrari. So only limits on resources will stop this, and this is what degrowth points to. Now, there is a question, of course, of whether capitalist growth can survive such limitation. So capitalism has grown by exploiting cheap natures and cheap people. So to think that somehow it will still grow without them is like thinking that you could, I don't know, force the players of the Lakers to play basketball with only one end and expect that they can still win the NBA. So let me move now to the second critique. This is that degrowth condemns poor countries and people to stay poor. So to be clear, with degrowth, we address well-off people in the global north. But we do believe that degrowth in the north will relieve pressure from extraction and unequal exchange on impoverished nations. So it will also open political space to those who fight for alternatives to a one-way future of Western-based development in, say, Latin America or Africa. And they should know what will levy the fight where we live and where the ideology of growth started, the West. And in this way, we open up space for the pluriverse of alternatives to growth-based development that exists around the world. If you want, you can have a look at this other book that we published. But the argument here is that to claim that the North should grow out of charity for the South is a bad joke, thinking of the colonial pillage that made growth possible. As LSE economist Jason Eccles reports, donor countries reappropriated 2.5 times the aid they gave developing countries through debt payments and capital flights. So growth is an effective mechanism for alleviating poverty. In countries like the US or the UK, around 50% of the population remains poor. This share stacks in the 1970s, despite fourfold growth of the economy. So the poorest 60% of humanity receive only 5% of all new income generated by global growth. So basically economic growth does not benefit the poor. At this rate, it would take 207 years to eradicate poverty at $5 a day, global GDP reaching 170 times its present size. So the average income would have to be a fantastical $1.3 million per year, so that the poorest two-thirds would earn $5 per day. It's obviously nonsense, okay? So the last critique that degrowth politics faces is the fact that we are too utopian. So indeed, as William Rees wrote, the ecologically necessary might be politically impossible, and the politically acceptable ecologically impossible. Still, the political difficulties of degrowth do not make green growth any more possible. Granted, a transition away from growth will not happen just because we have strong arguments. Building commons and winning elections seems also a painfully slow and uncertain process, and the reaction should not be underestimated. Judging from the reaction to something more prosaic, like wearing a mask, things do not look good. Those of us who write about degrowth realize that we cannot wish growth and those who defend it away. Capitalist economy do depend on growth, and when there is no growth, people suffer. There are solid ideas on how economies can be stabilized without growth or how to secure well-being. But the politics of making these ideas dominant are far from easy, especially in a multipolar world driven by economic and geopolitical competition, where the economically weak are dominated by the military strong. A transition to something akin to degrowth would be messy, and it would happen, if it ever were to happen, under conditions that will not be of our own choosing. As we overshoot planetary boundaries and the planet heats, we should expect more economic and social instability, with new political dangers and new political possibility. Our responsibility as scientists is to state clearly which paths are feasible and desirable and which are not. And our task as citizens is to work with others to chart desirable paths and not disgrace to the barbarous business as usual holds for us. Thank you.